This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, where I'm very pleased to have as my special guest Scott Henderson, who's been doing research on the Apollo moon landings. This has been a subject of great interest to me for many, many years. I've done a number of interviews with Dennis Camino about it, for example, and of course we've just published the second edition of And I Suppose We Didn't Go to the Moon Either, which has a new essay by Dennis, in fact, as well as others supplementing the contents of that book. Scott, tell us a little about your background and how you became interested in the moon landing issue.
Well, good morning, sir. Thank you for having me on the show. Mark Sallin sends his best to you. And a little history about myself. I'm a chef by trade. I've always been interested in the moon landings, and in 1969 I was just starting high school. So the science teachers were, of course, very interested in it. It was a very hot topic, and all through high school, every science class we had, I mean, the moon landings and everything came up about it. We even had a model of the Saturn V rocket in the corner of the science room.
But of course, it was all predicated on the assumption we'd actually gone to the moon.
Well, of course, and in those days, of course, why would you question anything? And so for many years, I believed, like everyone else, that we went to the moon. And when I first started hearing about the conspiracy, I thought I better have a look, because I've always been interested in it. I always followed NASA. And when I first started, I mean, the first thing I was doing, I was looking for the evidence that we went. I wasn't looking the other way. But what I researched is that the people that were speaking and saying we didn't go had some real facts. And that just made me dive deeper into it. I spent probably 3 or 4 years still looking for the evidence that showed that we went. And the harder I got into the subject, and the more I researched it, the more I realized that it didn't happen.
Yeah, it's quite disillusioning, isn't it, to discover some huge story, whether it happens to be JFK or 9/11 or the moon landing, was a pack of lies, a whopper perpetrated by the government on a gullible public. It's a shocking and disillusioning experience, Scott.
Oh, I realize that. The one thing that the fanboys of NASA claim is that it was easier to go than it was to fake it. Well, and as a matter of fact, they couldn't fake it either. Okay, they still filmed it.
Yeah, that was attributed to Stanley Kubrick by most, including Jay Weidner, for example, who showed it was done using what's known as front screen projection, where the background is every bit as much in focus as the foreground, which of course would be an optical impossibility were it bona fide, all authentic and on the up and up.
Well, yes, I've looked at his work, I've studied his work, and I've studied the involvement that Kubrick might have had. But you do realize that NASA has the largest studios in the world.
Isn't that appropriate? Scott,
Right?
let me turn to your slide set here. Apollo Photographic Studies. I'm just so very pleased to have you here. Here's our first.
Yeah, we'll start into it. The first set that we're going through are with the rover itself. This is the Apollo 17 rover. There are 3 of them, and it's very apparent in the picture. The one on the left in the screen is actually used in 15, 16, and 17 on it. The one at the top right is just used for a demonstration photo shoot. And the one at the bottom right is that's the photograph of the actual final resting place of the rover. And if you look carefully across the frame rail on that one at the bottom right, you'll see on the right-hand side, the links are quite a bit shorter on the right-hand side by the tire there, coming up. And then if you look at the one on the left, you'll see that they're quite a bit longer. The frame rail is completely different on the two machines.
Well, that's fascinating. And of course, I notice on the top right, we have what looks like tracks for the rover, but on the left-hand side, there are no tracks, which of course is very, very puzzling, unless perhaps a rover was set down using a crane.
Well, if you realize that they might have driven it in, if you realize that they were probably shooting it multiple times, okay, and the set crews and that would be out there, they'd have to rake off all of their footprints so that only the astronauts' footprints are in the shot. So in fact, when they were regrooming the set, they inadvertently had raked over all of the tracks as well. That's my theory on how that happens.
But of course, you'd agree there's something funny there, because we should have tracks. If indeed moon dust retains any tracks, we see a number of footprints there, which suggests it does. My belief is, since the moon is bereft of atmosphere, that you could no more leave tracks in moon dust than you could in the sands of the Sahara.
That's right. Well, of course, this was not shot on the moon, so the tracks are there, right? And they're very defined. If you go to the next slide on there, that on the left is Apollo 16. That is the first photograph where the fender fell off of. And the one on the right is Apollo 17. I mean, they were literally using the same equipment for all of the 6 missions that they photographed. That you'll see it that more apparently as we run through them, that it's the same equipment being used, and you can see it age over time. So the astronauts in Apollo 17 took one of the maps off and put it on the fender. And that's how it got there. But it actually fell off in Apollo 16. It's the same rover, that particular one. Now, this is also Apollo 16 in this one. And if you look just above the fender there, you can see that the steering arm has fallen down. Okay, and the steering was damaged in Apollo 15 and apparently was magically repaired by parking it in the shade overnight. and that's done by a well-respected presenter that put that out. I won't say who it is. But what happened is the front steering broke, so the front tires would just splay out. So the only way to keep it running and going is they were driving it backwards. And on the right-hand photograph there, you're looking at the tire tracks and the actual video of that. They've actually reversed the video, so it looks like it's driving forward, but it's exactly following the tracks. Now the chevron pattern on the tires show you which way it's running. They're driving that backwards, and they're stopping and taking pictures and driving it backwards. And there's about 70 or more photographs of that on it. And if you look at the photographs backwards, then it matches the video, because the video has been run in reverse, right? If they were actually driving over their own tire tracks, the chevron pattern would be the other way. Here is the same rover in 15, 16, and 17. Those are the top photographs on it. And the close-ups of the tire show that the left rear wheel axle has a leak in it, and it's coming out, and as the tire rotates, the oil is getting all over the rim, so the dirt is now sticking to it, right? And you can see it in 15 on the top left and 16 in the middle. That's apparently the sea rock there, that one in there. And the bottom are the blow-ups. And by the time you get to Apollo 17, which is the one on the right at the bottom, the oil is really leaking rapidly out of it, and it's going up the frame rail. It's going across the side frame on it, and other associated pictures with it. It's actually getting all over their suits as well.
And of course, Scott, wouldn't it have been all but impossible to repair a rover on the moon?
They had absolutely no contingency for any additional equipment when they were traveling, so they had no repair equipment. The amount of tools were cut down that they needed to have. They developed a bolt called a Boyd bolt, which is they just needed one tool and they just push it in and give it a half turn, and it releases the equipment. So all of the equipment were set up and designed with these Boyd bolts on it, so they only needed one tool.
It really looks like a shabby piece of equipment.
It really, well, the rover, like I said, they're using the same rover for all the missions. This is exactly the same machine for 15, 16, and 17. And I mean, these are hand-built machines. There's no way that they would reproduce the same problem.
And of course, it was ostensibly just left on the moon for subsequent flights so that the astronauts wouldn't be saddled with the problem of transporting another rover to the moon.
Well, if you had a problem with the rover in 1969 or 1970, right? Or 70 or 71, they put it up there, right? And they saw that it was a problem, they'd certainly work on the next one to make sure it didn't have a problem before they loaded it on the rocket, wouldn't they? They'd be testing all that equipment out again. They certainly have this same problem over and over again. It definitely shows that it's the same machine. And this is Apollo 16. This is the jump salute, and that's a failed attempt at reduced gravity of the moon, because he's only jumping about 18 inches off the ground. And this rover is the only picture of this particular rover, and it's identified by having a double rib on the front left tire, on the fender there. It's the only shot of it going, and it's a perfectly clean rover. You see there's no dirt or dust or anything on it. It's just set there for this photo shoot.
A double rib, yes, I see it there.
Yes.
So how can they account for having two rovers on the moon?
Well, they didn't. They were just using multiple equipment while they were filming it. Like I said, they weren't able to properly fake a full simulation of it, but they still filmed it anyway and did the very best they could. And this is what they were doing. When the equipment broke down, they just brought another piece in while they were filming it.
Hoping that no one would pay close enough attention to even notice the difference.
You have to realize in 1969 that the only photographs available to the public were just what they put out for the media. There might be 2 or 3 dozen for each mission that were put out for magazines and newspapers and, you know, National Geographic, that kind of thing, right? That they put them in. The other hundreds of photos or thousands of photos were not available to the public, right? And when NASA first put up, even on their first website, right, there was only a limited amount there. And in 1999, Kip Teague, working for NASA, put the entire journal up of all the photographs. And of course, 3 years ago, they put them on Flickr as well. They've updated them and put them on Flickr as well for the public to see. And NASA claims that on Flickr in the last 3 years, they've had over 1 billion views of the photographs.
Well, 1 billion views are going to lead to a lot of observations of anomalies of the kind you're observing here. And of course, these, which you're reporting, are novel to me, but I've seen hundreds of others before, including converging shadows implying more than one source of light, that you have illumination of an astronaut on the dark side of the lander where he ought to be in darkness. The waving flag, of course, in an environment where there's alleged to be no atmosphere, the classic conspiracy theory, did we land on the moon, even shows that the astronauts are being elevated by the use of cables. I mean, it's embarrassingly bad, Scott. As you observe, the deeper you get into it, the worse it becomes, the more elaborate the fraud.
That's right. Well, the one thing that I have stayed away from is reproducing anyone else's work. Okay? The information I give and what I put in the photographs are all of my findings, right? I certainly have looked at all the other findings, right, that people have found in there. I mean, it's you know, easy for a lot of people to go out and have comments on what other people have discovered or done. And what is unique, and what Marcus Allen himself was impressed with, as well as David Percy, is the amount of detail you can find in there to show how much more there is to it. I mean, there's 10,000 photographs of them, you know, to look through. So there's just endless amount of stuff. And because it's shot here on Earth, okay, and the location of where it's being shot, I mean, it's actually shot in a landfill site, junkyard, like a scrap metal site, basically. And what is underneath that dirt is absolutely amazing, and we're going to find some of that very shortly when we go through.
I love it. You mentioned the staggering number of photographs. Jack White, who is a legendary photo and film analyst from JFK, with whom I did a great deal of elaboration, became interested in the Apollo photographs, and of course also has a website there. And he just did a simple calculation of the number of minutes available to take photographs and the number of photographs taken, and discovered that if this were all authentic, the astronauts would have had to have been taking photographs at the rate of 1 every 50 seconds, which of course is completely absurd.
They wouldn't be able to do anything else. There's a few other things. Here are the 17 rover. This is right in front of the rear right wheel. Okay, that's the frame rail. You can see the arm that's going up there on the left. The arm that the arrow shoots through is for the seat itself. So you can see that in each of the photographs where it's sitting. The actual frame behind that is completely different in each one of the photographs. And I mean, it's part of the structure of the rover itself. You can't just change that. Those are the 3 separate rovers, and that clearly identifies that there are 3 separate machines. You can see the way they're constructed.
I presume the rover was simply a variation on a dune buggy of the kind we find in Southern California ubiquitously.
Except they made this one fold up with 4 electric motors running the tires. And on the bottom are the 3 different treads that they actually make.
Which is completely ridiculous. You're supposed to have one rover with 1 set of tires, not leaving 3 set of tread tracks.
Well, it should always look the same, right? The one on the left that's very square, the top left of the tire tracks.
Yeah.
You can see it's a perfectly straight line. Well, the Apollo 15 rover was damaged. It damaged the steering and everything else. And when they tried to fix it up, it's actually dog tracking so that the tire kicks a little sideways, so that instead of the chevron, it's only running on one part of the tire, so it looks like a square bar.
You mean that you are suggesting there's a legitimate explanation for this variation in the tracks?
That's the one rover. That's the top left tread. That rover's damaged. This is Apollo 17 though. This rover's been running around in 15, 16, and 17. Okay, that's the same rover that broke down, that the steering arm fell off in 16 that we saw in the other picture. It's the same rover. They keep repairing this thing and keep using it over and over again, even though it's damaged.
Do we have any records of the astronauts performing these repairs? Were they photographing their work on the rover?
No, of course they didn't photograph the work on the rover. Okay, I mean they were sitting on Earth, and the entire support crew were coming in there, and probably Grumman and Boeing and everybody else are trying to keep this stuff running.
It's just an elaborate joke. It's such a ruse.
Yeah. Now this is Apollo 17, and they just threw the arm away when they were done. That steering arm right there is on the ground, and it finally fell off the rover completely. So they threw it away, and then they set a golf ball down beside it. And Apollo 14 is the only one that claimed to have a golf ball. And if anyone is analyzing this photograph in particular, and you zoom in about 10 times in, you'll start to see golf balls all over there. They were using this as a driving range when they were having lunch between filmings.
Scott, that's stunning. That's just embarrassingly bad.
The only thing I haven't found is what brand of pizza box they were using for lunch. You know, like it's pretty amazing when you look at some of these photographs.
The arrogance of this operation, you know, just treating the American public as though they were nothing but a vast collection of morons.
Now, if you're looking at the ground here, it doesn't match the background. Okay, the mountain in the background is quite a bit different color, and you'll see the change when they're shooting through this valley on it. And the reason why it's darker is because it had rained.
Because they had rained on the moon.
No, it had rained on the set on.
I know, that's what I'm saying, though, Scott.
Right?
I mean, that's absurd.
You can see that it's rained, and if you look at the ground, you can see how it's speckled or rough, just like it's rained. It's through there on it. That's why the footprints, okay, when you disturb the soil, should be the same color underneath. Okay, it shouldn't be darker. That only, like if you're walking through perfectly dry sand and you kick the sand up, it's still the same color.
Right.
Underneath. But if it's got water in it, then it's darker.
That's right. Of course.
And this is exactly what you're looking at in the photograph. And I mean,
Scott, I love it. This is just fantastic stuff.
Yes. Now, these are this is just one example of the checklist, the cuff checklist. These are worn on the wrist or the cuff, right? And it's a little set of instructions for the astronauts. But what they actually are instructions on how to film each scene.
Yes, this is the script. This is the script.
This is the storyboard, right? The astronauts, of course, they had their own communications. They couldn't have anybody else giving them instructions over a mic that's being recorded live for them or whatever they're doing, right? And they were restricted in their vision, so they couldn't have people giving them hand signals. So they had to write these things up for them and say, this is what you got to do. So it actually gives them the timeline, because the DAC cameras either had a 4-minute reel or a 12-minute reel. So it gives them the timeline, what they're doing. And if you look at the top left, the LMP is the lunar module pilot that shows him where he's going to be standing. Okay, it shows where the footprints are. It shows where the disturbed area is, right? It showed where the rock, where the hole was and where they set the rock, how to do it. And then it shows where it says 1, 2, 3 on the thing there, that it shows the camera settings and where to stand for the commander to take those photographs and how many photographs to take. Okay, and on the top right, it's a full description of a boulder right down to the exact size. Now this boulder is about third, half, 50% bigger than a football. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, it shows the exact time that the astronauts would arrive This is Station 9. And of course, they laid the stations out too. They mapped all those out before they went. These are done months before they even took off, so-called, to go to the moon. So how did they know that there'd be a football size or twice as big as a football shaped rock there, and know what the mineral contents were once they split it open when they got there?
Scott, this is devastating, devastating stuff.
Absolutely. And then when you look at the bottom, on the bottom left, you'll see that it says photos taken, past tense.
Yes.
Okay. But they even know the direction of the sun, where to set the cameras up in the direction of the sun. How do you know which direction this rock is going to be located at when it's only that big?
Because, of course, they're prepping the set. I mean, it all is just so incredibly revealing and so damning of the whole project, Scott.
Well, you see, they went out and they collected the rocks here on Earth, and then they designed the set. So they set up the different stations, and that's where they're going to have the different samples of rocks coming from. And these are all laid out in the storyboard on the cup checklist.
Fascinating.
All ahead of time, right? That's how you get the station layout. Even though the exact time, like if you can imagine the exact time, you have to start from launch and calculate that that's when they're going to show up. I mean, if you did one extra orbit around the moon, you wouldn't even land in the same. There's 5 alternate landing sites for each mission.
They left nothing to chance, of course, and nevertheless, they slipped up in innumerable different ways.
Yes, and this one here on the this is the video that they put up on the internet. It's called the Grand Prix. Okay, and if you listen to the commentary, it's like they're just, okay, we'll give it some gas and make a turn here and do this and do that. It's all laid out for them here right in the cuff checklist, that they drive through the first crater, go around the other 2 craters and drive through the last one. The camera positions are sitting there, and of course, the astronaut is taking photographs of this and running both those cameras at the same time. I mean, both those cameras have to move to follow the rover.
Doesn't this require more cameramen than we have astronauts?
Well, there's only 2 there. The one on the right, Jones is the inspector for the filming. Okay, and they've penciled him in here on the thing. And there are a couple of people on the internet that claim that Jones is actually a crater, and they've reproduced a map showing that Jones was an actual crater. They drew a big circle around it, claiming it's a crater, and they've modified the commentary right at the Apollo site. So they must be working for either NASA or Phil Plait, Bad Astronomy, because he updates and does stuff on the Apollo General site. However, the photographs do not. If that was a crater there, a large crater, the one that they drew and put a map up for, first of all, they never traversed through a crater. And if you look at the depth of these craters, okay, there's no way you're going to drive the rover through it. At no time did they do that. And that straight line is the traverse line where the rover is driving down there. And if you look at the most of the craters on there, they're all done with British names. There's Camelot and Henry and Shakespeare and stuff like that, right? Not Jones.
No.
Okay. But there's nothing to support their claim that there's actual crater there where Jones is, what they've reproduced a map for. Okay. Nothing else supports that.
And you believe it was actually a director or an inspector or someone who was...
Just go to the next screen.
Overseeing the shooting of the scene?
Right, just go to the next screen. There he is right there. That color plate.
Oh yeah, Inspector Jones, yeah.
That color plate is at the start of the photographs, right? They're at the, or sorry, this is at the start of the video that's running on here.
Scott,
and of course,
so this is so revealing in and of itself, for crying out loud.
And how, if Post is the photographer, he wasn't on board. He never went to the moon. Now look at the date. 28th of November, 1972. Well, they didn't launch until December the 7th. The launch date for Apollo 17 was December the 7th. This was shot on the 28th of November.
Or about 10 days before they even took off.
Yes. Now, all of these videos are online. The raw uncut videos have this color plate at the start of them, and it shows the date, the inspector, and the photographer for each of them. And all
really?
of them,
Really? So it's that blatant, it's that obvious, it's that accessible.
it's that accessible. They're all on YouTube. If you take a look at any of the missions, okay, they're all there, and they're all taken beforehand.
How can anyone be taken in, Scott? I mean, after seeing what you presented already, I can't believe anyone could continue to believe this was real, any of it. It was also obviously staged and faked and phony.
Right. Well, like I said, they claim it was impossible for them to fake, and it was. Okay? They couldn't manage zero gravity. They messed that up, because the only time the astronauts would be in weightless condition would be when they were in orbit around either the Earth or the Moon. When they reached that equilibrium, that they would be weightless. When they're traveling to and from, they wouldn't necessarily be weightless. They'd still, you're pulling away from the Earth, you're going to be affected by the gravity. But they didn't know that, so they showed them being weightless the entire way, right? The videos of them supposedly in 1/6 gravity on the moon, I mean, you see them tripping and falling, you see the wires pulling them up, you know, after they fell down because they couldn't stand up and things like that. And of course, if you look on their suits, they have clips right at their waist. There's two big hooks right there for the wires to hook onto, right on their suits. It's pretty amazing. Okay, on the left is Apollo 11, and the helium tank there is in quadrant 1. And what isn't shown is the extra batteries for the their backpacks, the Bliss, are down on the left-hand side on that. And that helium tank pressurizes the 4 fuel tanks to push it through the engine. Okay, on the image on the right, okay, you can see where the ladder is. You're still quadrant 1 where that big black arrow is. That's a little schematic of the rover, and that's the 2 tires folded in, and it's in there. So the helium tank has been removed. Okay, and if you remove the helium tank, you can't pressurize the fuel to run the engine.
So what you're saying is even from the point of view of the engineering design, it's a preposterous arrangement.
Well, they had to add the rover to it somehow, so they simply removed the helium tank. Okay, they didn't. It's not relocated. There is no other spot to relocate it. Okay, the engine sits in the center square, and then the 4 around it, the 4 squares around it are where the fuel tanks sit. Okay, and then what's left over on the side are the bays, which are triangulated in, right? To fill in the bays. So you have your payload bay and your experimental equipment is in 2, right? And quadrant 1, this is where the helium tank was and the extra batteries for their backpacks. That's all been removed just to hold the rover in place. The thing won't run. The engine won't run without that tank. Well, that's what NASA says. I think it would run just fine without that tank, but
the whole thing was just junk. This is just junk, Scott.
Yeah. Now, this is an interesting shot. The first thing you should take note of is that is the CSM. Okay? And the picture is supposed to be shot from the lunar module. Now, at no time was the lunar module in a higher orbit above the CSM. And the following photographs of that, the CSM is actually descending to the moon, which it didn't do, only the LEM did. Now, the second part of this is that is the moon behind it, nice, brightly lit up. So the silver reflection on that should have nothing but the blackness of space. There's nothing else there. There might be a little image of the lunar module, but that's not what you're looking at. This thing is hung up in a hangar somewhere, and if you look at the close-up, you'll see that there's the 2 doors are there. Those are colonial-style doors. One has the window in it, right? The other one, you can see the handle and the latch on it. And then back on the right-hand side, there's 3 guys standing there. 2 are facing to the left, and the other one is facing forward. And if you look at it, you can see their arms, their hair, their faces are all there in those images.
Now, you mentioned the blackness of space. My presumption has been that the sky would be ablaze with points of light that were distant stars, that they wouldn't be twinkling because of the lack of atmosphere. But either way, you should be looking up at the CSM, not down toward the moon.
Down. But because it is pointing up, okay, even if it's not going to show stars or anything else, that should only be the blackness of space. There should be nothing else reflecting off of that. Okay? And that's exactly what you're looking at. I mean, like there'd be a bright reflection of the sun, wherever it's sitting on it. And there might be a little spot because of the angle of that cone, right? There'd be a little dot of the lunar module would show up in it, and neither of those are there.
Well, your most devastating point is the CSM was never in a lower orbit below the LM, and therefore the photograph is impossible.
It travels way down. The series of photographs of this, it's traveling very low down. It gets down to a little tiny dot that you have to zoom in to even see it. It's that much lower. And there's absolutely no way, and all of their other documents that support the orbits and their paths never show the CSM below the LEM. The LEM comes up to it and joins with it. This is an interesting photograph. This is of course, the iconic photograph of Buzz Aldrin. And he's actually pointing at his watch. And because the astronauts themselves are the whistleblowers, they do a lot of pointing stuff out. A lot of pointing stuff out. And if you see, the watch is 14 minutes after 11. And David Percy wrote up the article on here on the importance of the 11 and 14 for both the Freemasons and NASA. The fact of the matter is, he stepped on Buzz Aldrin's, the official file is he stepped on at 3:16:15 UTC time. and that would make it a quarter after 11 Florida time, I think. However, this photograph was taken 59 minutes and 20 seconds after he set foot on the moon. So it should say quarter after 12 if he was set on Florida time. Okay. If he was on Houston time, it would be quarter after 11, which is also Arizona time, right?
Expand on this significance for Freemasons and NASA and the role of the astronauts in blowing whistles, even though clearly they have been severely constrained, possibly even threatened with the loss of their lives if they should speak out openly about the fraud.
I believe that at the time, with the death of their three Grissom,
yeah,
Chaffee, Grissom, and White,
yeah,
I believe that they were very disgruntled employees. Okay, and you can't imagine, unless you've ever had a disgruntled employee, you can imagine how they will mess you up, and they will mess you up in ways you can't imagine. And I mean, over time, those things pass. These people were paid a lot of money after the fact, and if you realize that every one of them quit right after their missions, all of the astronauts quit. Why wouldn't you work for NASA? You know, you're Neil Armstrong. You're known worldwide. It's the best advertising they could have. Why couldn't they keep him there? Right? Why couldn't they keep any of these people there?
Who wants to live a lie?
Well, most of them became alcoholics. Buzz Aldrin's rather well known for that. But when they were shooting the photographs in their very disgruntled state and upset with their employer, they took these photographs to reveal the fraud. They are the whistleblowers. And when you start looking through at what they point out and how they point it out and how they reveal it, and we're going to get into a few of those, so that how they point things out. This one right here, this is interesting because on the right is the live TV camera shooting. And if you see that arm that's sitting out there, just at the bottom of the ladder, okay, you can see where the camera should be sitting. And what's coming down, that shadow coming down on the ladder, is Aldrin's leg. On the left-hand photograph, okay, when you look, there's no camera there. Now, NASA claims that that camera was on that pallet that folded down and came out, and where the location of that is in between, in that black spot in between the rungs, is where the camera is actually sitting mounted. And it is mounted there. But that's the one they drag out and set out on the ground to pull it out 100 feet and shoot from there.
Well, these photographs are basically completely incompatible.
Well, it's shot at different times. They shot the video.
Aldrin appears to be in the shade, whereas here on the left, he's very clearly, illuminated.
Well, that's right. It's shot at different times, different lighting, different everything.
I mean, in and of itself, this proves the fraud right here. In fact, many of your different presentations, each of them is sufficient to show the whole thing was an elaborate hoax.
But why isn't Armstrong in the photograph, in the live video? He has to be, you can see where he has to be standing to shoot that. It's shooting both the legs back, right? When you're looking there, you can see him shooting both the legs back. He has to be out on that side of that ladder.
Roughly where the name Aldrin appears.
Yes, he has to be standing there. And that bright spot is where he walks around to. If you're watching the video, he just appears around there long before, like, you see him taking some photographs or whatever. and then he walks around behind there. But Buzz hasn't even started down the ladder when he disappears. And the only way that could happen is it's shot at 2 different times. They're doing multiple takes. Multiple, changing the lighting. Here's an example of them changing the lighting up. Now, this photograph wouldn't have come out till '99, and I know a lot of people have researched it. I couldn't believe when I hit it that nobody had found it before me, because it's very blatant. There's 3 or 4 of them in the series on this, showing this lighting. So I just took 2 because it shows the lighting with the shadow one direction, the lighter shadow one direction, and then they've adjusted the lighting, and now it's off to the other side.
Just unbelievably insulting.
Okay, and nobody can explain this. Like, if somebody's going to go around and say, well, there was a guy out there running around and this reflected light is coming off his suit like Mythbusters, right? Both these guys are inside the LEM at the time when they shot this. It's just as blatant as that. This one, Paul and I did a full video on this. This is the Apollo 16, and the side of the craft, it literally explodes. Those panels literally are blown off on their simulated liftoff. Okay? And if you look at the top right, you can see that the paint, like they're using the same LEM over and over again, and the paint is peeling back on it. And I imagine the astronauts are so frustrated, they just decided to blow the panels off the side of it so that they could get the thing fixed up. Right? And the video shows them blowing that off. The bottom right-hand photo there shows the panels literally torn apart. And what is behind those panels are all of the sensitive instruments and controls that run that machine. Okay, and when you see the size of the explosion in the video of the takeoff of the Apollo 16, okay, this thing would have ruptured the hull and completely, wouldn't just disable the machine, it would just literally explode with the amount there when it ruptured the hull in that kind of a vacuum. Okay.
So it would have destroyed their ability to launch from the moon.
Well, this thing on liftoff, that's all of their controls and relays, telecommunications, everything else are behind that panel, directly behind it. And anyone listening to this, just watch the video from Paul on the plane of the Apollo 16 liftoff. Well, we have 6 or 7 out right now.
When I was a kid, there was a real cheesy TV program called Flash Gordon, and they had very primitive props. This is reminiscent of Flash Gordon, Scott.
Absolutely. I have been I've been studying how they were doing the simulated landings and takeoffs, and Paul and I will be doing a video on it as well. I believe they were using steam, high pressure steam, to simulate the landing. And then when they got to the liftoff, all of that equipment was in the lander part, so they didn't have anything to simulate an exhaust on takeoff. And I actually have a shot of the interior control panel inside the LEM, and it shows a full bank of heater switches, and then it shows gauges, and it says steam pressure right on it.
Steam pressure right on it.
Right on the panel. And that, you got to watch that video because Paul and I are going to put that one up.
I love it. I love it, Scott.
Okay. Now this is some real staging. And it took me a long time because I was kind of stuck on the fact that the wheel was off the ground. And I still haven't figured out why they did that. if you look at this tool, they've set it up on this dirt pile. Well, first of all, this dirt pile looks like it was put there by a front-end loader, and there's no other dirt pile like this on any of the photographs, right? They're all kind of smoothed over little mounds, but not just a pile of dirt like this. So I'm looking at this tool, and it just struck me that the shadow of the tool makes an arrow. Well, if it's an arrow, it's pointing to something. So I zoomed in, and if you look at the center image, the blown up image there, you can see the black ring and the rubber tip of the glove on the pinky finger. And then if you follow it up to the top, there's three little knobs at the top that they've held it in place with. That's a right-handed glove. And of course, there's enough dirt falling off it that you can see how white it is, right? On the top right, those are gloves sticking out of the dirt. You can see there's 4 fingers, 4 fingers, 4 fingers, 4 fingers. And when you look through that entire pile of dirt on that side, there's probably a whole skid full of gloves. And they probably had a manufacturer that, you know, they'd be putting out contracts for different stuff. They didn't use this particular style of glove, but there's other kinds of work gloves in there, and they're stacked up in like half a dozen in a stack and bunch together, and you can see the fingers sticking out all over it just by zooming in and looking on this thing.
This is an anomalous and inadvertent product placement, Scott.
This one photograph showed that everybody was in on it. The people that were designing the sets, the camera crew, and the astronauts. Okay, out filming this. They put this together and set it up.
And you can see they would have had to have done that for security, because if someone were naive and thought this were bona fide, they'd of course have their mind blown and they'd be a security risk. So they had to recruit with the understanding that what they were doing was simulating a moon landing and that they were consigned to secrecy.
Well, they're trying to expose it as best they could, but they still had to get these photographs past NASA.
Yes.
Right? So
yeah.
Here it is. Here it is. You look at it. If you don't look at it, you imagine somebody in NASA looking at the photographs, and they went out there and they shot 1,000, 1,500 photographs, right? And they're looking through them for clarity, color, whether they're in focus, whether they're sun blinded or whatever, right? They're not looking at the details that's in there because they're assuming that these people are doing their job. All of this stuff is in there. Okay. And yes, it took 50 years to get to this point. Many thousands of people have looked at these photographs. I mean, like when Marcus Allen, if you realize what he was doing, it's absolutely amazing, because the only photographs he had were just a few dozen, or I think maybe a dozen is all he had. And they were designed for magazines and any other media events, right? These things were airbrushed over, corrected, color corrected, centered, the whole 9 yards, right? And he's looking at the photographs and he's saying, God, the lighting's not right. This isn't right. That isn't right. He's spotting that out. That's incredible compared to what I have. First of all, I have what everybody else, like, that there's something to look for. And I have every photograph available. I've downloaded every photograph. I have them all to look through. And I'm sitting here with a 4K video screen, 30-inch video screen, and I can zoom in 10, 15 times, and it's still clear. It doesn't pixelate, right? I can see the detail, right? Nobody had that 20, 25 years ago, 30 years ago. So what they did, like, even you know, like Ralph Renee and Bill Casing and that, they should have settled this back then. I mean, James Collier, he had them dead to rights as well. David Percy, you know, Bart Sabrell. Every piece of evidence that they have come up with, any one of them, NASA should have conceded. Well, with what I have, they might as well throw all these photographs away, because it clearly shows the intent of the astronauts exposing this fraud. Now, this is Apollo 15. When they were simulating, and Paul and I have done a video on this as well, when they were simulating the landing of this, they actually dropped the machine. Okay? It crashed to the ground. It dropped probably 8 or 10 feet when they were lowering it down on the gantry crane, hard enough that it broke the leg right off. On the one side, the secondary struts are snapped out and the thing kicks out. That's the exhaust bell housing has been crushed on it, and it hit hard enough that the rover came right off. Okay? Broke the rover right off its mounts. On the right are the two schematics of the rover. The top one shows the schematic of the actual lowering arms, how it swung out and down. And on the bottom is, with the rover in place, just the schematic of that square, and then the wheels go in on the angle in there to fill that spot. So when you look over at the actual photograph, the two big arms are the ones at the bottom that come up on the 45-degree angle up to the rover. They're sheared, you can see they're sheared right off. And the close-up photo of it, you can see the lanyards. It's a spaceship, right? It's a ship, so they're lanyards, cables, right? Both those cables are snapped clean off on there. That's how the Apollo 15 rover got damaged initially. That's how the steering got damaged. That's how the fenders got damaged. The seats were damaged. And as well, one of the batteries, they even logged that the one battery bank was down. It wasn't functioning at all.
And you mentioned here, note the mold on the sewage bag, an example of equipment aging over time. But Scott, doesn't mold itself prove this is not on the moon where there's no atmosphere and no moisture? I don't believe it would be possible to have mold on the moon.
No, but there's a lot on Earth. Flip to the next photo. We just go through and we'll get to there. Now this is those are their backpacks on the ground. If you look at the top right one, you'll see one has the covers taken off, and the other one there is sitting up underneath the machine, still together. And of course, the astronaut taking the photograph has to have one on. He can't function out there. And the astronaut in the background's got one on, and only two were supplied.
So we got 2 extra backpacks.
Well, that backpack isn't really a backpack. That's just a cooling system for the suit. When you're running around doing a simulation on Earth, you got to keep these guys cool in those suits, and that's all that is. That's the sublimated core. What's laying outside that thing is sublimated core. Before we go to the next photograph, that leg there is the ball swivel joint is snapped right off when it landed. The leg is sitting off to the side of the pad. It's pushed right off to the side. It should be in the center. It's actually broken right off.
Well, the equipment was so flimsy to begin with. I mean, you know, nothing like this could have sustained the actual pressures and stresses to which it was purportedly subjected on the moon. Had any of this been real, I think this flimsy thing would have fallen apart immediately.
Yes. Flip the next one up. There we go. Okay. On the right-hand side there, on the ground, are the ball swivel joints for the secondary strut. Now, they didn't even clean this equipment up. All the broken pieces, you can see all the broken pieces have been stuffed up underneath the machine. But those are the 2 ball swivel joints that broke off of that leg. Okay? And on the left-hand side, if you're looking, the leg on the left, you can see the distance, the length of that leg is a lot shorter than the one on the right. because they had to bring in another strut long enough to prop it back up because it was now sitting in that crater.
The one on the right being longer than the one on the left.
Well, the legs actually do compress. The bottom 32 inches compresses down, but if the one on the left had compressed, the foil would have rolled up. Okay?
Yeah.
It hasn't compressed at all. So the other one they replaced it in, the one on the left is 32 inches up to where the secondary strut comes in, and the other one is around 4 feet.
Or 48 inches, a foot longer.
When the astronauts, you see photographs of the astronauts walking up, that's almost at the shoulder height, and the other one's at their waist.
And then, of course, if this had been bona fide, they'd be symmetrical, the same length.
Well, they would compress down shorter.
Right.
Now, here's the close-up of this is a museum photograph, what they have on display in the museum. And in the center there, that round core, that is the sublimator on a full active backpack, the PLSS, right? The battery's down on the bottom right, the oxygen tank's on the bottom left, and the 2 oxygen purge tanks are at the top, right? What's on the ground beside that leg is just 2 canisters with that sublimator core to keep the suit cool. Like, they didn't need to have extra oxygen or anything. They're running around on Earth. They just needed to keep the suit cool, and that's what you see. You see that core in there. Pretty amazing, eh? This is Apollo 15. That is the opposite side. Straight across from Quadrant 1. On it, Quadrant 3, this is shooting in from Quadrant 3, and you can see the scratch marks down on the bottom and the wrinkle on it. And then on the right is Apollo 17. They never replaced the bell housing underneath it when they were doing the simulations. They fixed the rest of the machine up. Well, they got it off the ground. They got the legs adjusted right for it. They got it back up off the ground. But the same scratches are on there. They're identical scratches on there, and the wrinkle's still in there.
Close enough for government work, Scott.
Yeah, pretty amazing, eh?
Stunning.
This shows that they're simulating. This is the hammer and the feather. Okay? And they dropped the hammer and the feather right beside the strap that broke. That great big strap. You saw the cables that were on the rover. That is the heaviest piece of equipment that they would need, right? On those little tiny cables. This is a gantry lifting strap. 4 of these would lift that machine off the ground. And there it is, broken on the ground.
And what in the world is a feather doing on the moon?
Well, that's where they did the simulate the that they were in a
gravitational fall.
Yes, so both fall at the same time. So they nicely set it up so that they dropped it so it would be right beside. So when they shot the hammer and the feather, they're also shooting.
Reminiscent of Galileo and the Leaning Tower of Pisa.
Right, but they made sure they dropped it so that the strap would be in the shot. That's why they dropped it in that spot. Okay, this is Apollo 11. And that's one of Buzz Aldrin's cars down the bottom right there. I Googled that to pull that up.
The car is actually in the photograph? At the top there with the arrow?
Yeah.
That's the car? And you can see it on the top right? Yeah. Scott! This is awful. This is so amateurish.
Okay, flip to the next one. There's more than one car in here. There's another one.
I'm breathless. I'm breathless.
It's a junkyard. Over to the right on the rocks, you can see where the car is way back in the distance there. Over to the right of the rocks, there's more cars that are buried, sticking up. One's kind of half in, the other one's kind of upside down. It's a virtual junkyard. is what you're looking at. And you realize in the 60s, most people don't realize that, is they didn't recycle metal the same way. They just put them out. They put them out in yards and disposed of them that way. Right? How do you like that one? That's everybody loves the
Corvette.
Yeah.
Wow.
Very distinctive. Now,
Covered in lunar material and dust. I love it, Scott.
well, you know the spray insulation foam that they use to cover metal.
Yeah.
9/11, you know, insulate the steel so it doesn't burn.
Yeah.
They use the same kind of stuff. Disney used the same kind of stuff to do it. If you look at the old Star Trek, they made the rocks for the original Star Trek out of the same kind of stuff, right? So this is how they prepped the set, right? They just sprayed all of that down on it. Now, when you look at this vet that is smashed up there and the windshield's crushed down, it's quite a bit shorter at the front. But what people may not realize is that it was a fiberglass car, so the metal didn't have metal rippled up. When it got into a front end accident, the fiberglass would just break off, right? So what you're looking at, you can see the one arrow there. I'm showing the front axle sitting there to the rear, and that is the tow bar is still left in place on the front of that thing, right? The back of it is very distinctive. You can't miss a 1960s Corvette for the shape of that, and there's absolutely no way that a rock would look like that to have the rear axle sitting there like that in that perfectly round shape, and the rear fenders.
My stomach's just in knots over the absurdity of all of this, Scott.
Okay, now down. This is the same crater that ancient aliens found the robot head, right? Well, it's actually just a doll's head. I've found it down here as well. And there's other things. That entire pile of stones down in the middle there, that's just a pile of junk. There's big truck axles and all kinds of stuff in there, transmissions, you name it. And there's 2 more cars right at the bottom of the hill there.
This is just pathetic.
There's a 59 T-Bird down at the bottom of there. Now, this is the central station. This powers all of the experimental equipment on it. You can see that it's between the different missions. They just left it laying down on its back on the ground. The dirt is stuck to it, and it's actually rusted the metal. You can see that on the bottom left, the zoom in there. You can see the metal's all rusted. So it's just been laying around. Okay? So
But it shouldn't rust on the moon either because there's no atmosphere and no moisture.
Well, considering the fact that the equipment is said to be prepared in a clean room, put in a rocket, unloaded, set up, and then photographed right away. How much time would it have to do any of this stuff? Right? You take it out of the box and you set it up and you take a photograph of it. It's got to be perfectly clean, right?
Just so sloppy. They were so sloppy the way they did all of this, Scott.
Now, what is intentional about this is the astronauts have peeled the foil back to show you that there's nothing inside of it.
Yeah.
This is supposed to be packed full of, first of all, it's supposed to have radio communications. It's supposed to collect all of the data from all of the other experiments and relay that information back to the Earth, as well as power all of that other equipment. Okay, and if you look at the so-called computer cables at the bottom, those bands there, that's just translucent film. There's no wires in it. You can see right through it. There's nothing in there at all. Down on the bottom left, on the right-hand picture, that piece of steel there, that's an electrical conduit, and up to a switch that looks exactly like what you'd see on an oil furnace. right? All the computer stuff is supposed to be underneath the bottom panel of that, but there's supposed to be a battery that's about twice the size of a car battery in there powering it, and then the nuclear power generator, the RTG, powers and recharges that battery for it. There's no battery in there. That's showing both sides of it with the foil torn off. There's nothing in that machine at all.
This whole thing is a joke, Scott.
This thing, can you imagine that thing is supposed to send the information back to Earth? There isn't even a proper antenna on it, nothing. This shot is Apollo 12, and this is the same piece of equipment with the experimental package attached to it. And then when you see the little crisscrosses down there, that's where the foil was piled up on it. And then it just came down to the bottom thing. That's exactly what it is. The previous image you were looking at, this is the same thing as it's set up. There's absolutely...
And more preposterous mold on the moon.
Well, yeah, it's been laying around. First of all, while they're rehearsing, none of it's functional. You realize that they did all this just... They're using the same equipment that they did to practice with. Like they probably thought at one time they were going to go to the moon, right? Wasn't going to happen. They didn't go out and put equipment down or anything else. They just simply are using the same equipment that they were practicing with, which are just mock-ups. None of the equipment is real, right? They're just mock-ups for them to play with. The only thing that was actually running and functioning was the rover. It was the only actual piece of equipment. And here's another piece of equipment on the bottom, on the left-hand side, the arrow showing down there, you can actually see water standing in there. It's perfect, smooth and flat. Okay.
No atmosphere, no water on the moon. Hence another dramatic refutation that this was taken on the moon. It's just so insulting, Scott. It's so insulting from beginning to end.
Right. If you take this out of the equipment bay or the bay in the LEM, set it on the ground and take a picture of it. How could it look like this? How could it get like that within a minute or so after you set it up? You take a picture after you set it up. You can see the water is dried back on the right-hand arrow there, right? The water is dried back and the mud is just caked onto it, and there's actually green mold around the edge of it. Okay? The same equipment is left lying around. That's Apollo 12 on the left-hand side and Apollo 14 on the right. And you see it's just been out in the sun baking until it started to crack.
So
see
where
you look at the top?
Where do you surmise this was taken?
The landfill site, okay, which is still in operation today, which is not only a military but a NASA landfill site, is on the southeast corner of Cinder Lake.
Of which lake?
Cinder Lake in Arizona. That's the Cinder Lake is the mock-up they did of the lunar surface where they put all the craters and blew all the craters in.
So it was actually shot in Arizona.
Well, I've had other people tell me to look other places because they believe it was other places. But then I went back and I looked at the log files. I studied all the astronauts. I studied all their log files, all their schedules, everything else, right? And they were flying back and forth between Florida and Arizona, right? And if you realize these guys, I mean, you can't just make those things up because those schedules are there, and those astronauts, I mean, they're media magnets, right? They're being interviewed every day. So they have to be where they said they're going to be, right? You can't interview a guy if he's off there, or if he's in Australia, or he's somewhere else, right? Like every day they were in the media. They're being interviewed while they're doing the training, everything else, because there was such a hype about it. So the log file when they say they took the T-38 trainer and flew from here to here, that's probably where they were. Well, that comes right up to the liftoff. Their schedules go right up to the liftoff. Okay, it's the only two places they can be.
Florida or Arizona.
Well, they had simulators in both, right? They had the large gantry crane. They did the practice simulation of landing the thing.
This suggests to me that Stanley Kubrick may not have had to have been involved. And so much of this is so amateurish. I don't believe this is consistent with his standards.
I think he would have walked away from it. I think the NASA did this on their own. Like I said, when I said they weren't capable of faking it, they didn't even really try.
Yeah.
Okay? They still filmed it. They couldn't fake it. They couldn't get there and they couldn't fake it, but they still filmed it. And that's what you're looking at. And this is the infamous Apollo 17 flag. And you can see that it's soaking wet. Okay? No bones about it. People say it's shadows or it's this or it's reflection of this or whatever. It's soaking wet. Okay? We've already been looking at water on the set. Okay? On the left, that's Jack Harrison Smith, Jack Smith, if you like, his nickname, Jack. He actually, they're just playing around in the mud, so he just picked up some mud and smeared it all over his arm there. And 2 photographs later, it's washed off again.
And you can't have mud on the moon any more than you can have water or air.
That is mud. You can see that the suit is wet where it's been washed off.
Yes.
Okay. And you can't have that on the moon either.
Mist.
Little morning mist. Somebody said it could be dust. Well, there's no wind either.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
The fact of the matter is, it just can't be there. Okay. This is the Surveyor. Okay. This thing managed to get to the moon all by itself. Landed by itself. Didn't need people on board or anybody else.
Didn't even need a transporter.
Okay. What is interesting is the Russian machine is identical to this. The panels, everything, even the way they're cut out, are identical. The only difference I found when I was studying it is the top panels. One are solar panels and the other is supposed to be a high gain antenna. These ones are supposed to be solar panels, and if you look, it's just a piece of particle board with a 1x3 down the front of it. Okay, and the other one, you can see where it was glued down to something else. It could have been an old countertop or school desk or something like that, and they're reusing it here.
Well, Scott, the then Soviet Union and the Chinese must be fully aware that this was all an elaborate fraud.
Well, they will be if they watch this show. And you can see there's standing water on top of the thing on the right there on that panel.
Yes.
You can quite clearly see it, and if you've really got a good thing, you can see where he wiped his finger because the cuff checklist tells them to wipe their finger. The mirror, the panoramic mirror on this thing is just covered in dust.
Well, you can even see a reflection from that little mound there in the water.
Yes, absolutely. But the panoramic mirror is pointing on an angle down, and it's covered in dust. The rest of this machine is absolutely whistle clean. I don't know how the thing is covered in dust. And of course, if it rains everywhere, and they're not going to get out 24 feet up in the air to clean this off. However, they did manage to take a photograph of it. This photograph is supposed to be a docking sequence in space, but not on the lunar surface.
Scott, this is all just embarrassingly bad. It's so amateurish. I'm just in shock.
This one's really going to get you. Okay? When I was looking back through all the PDFs, a pressure test that got to about 8 psi, and it blew the window out. That's about all it can handle. That's why they only claim to have 5.5 psi inside the machine. So they duct taped it back together and they put a rain guard on it. Well, the rain guard got broken somehow, probably when they were lifting it with those straps, right? Probably hooked it and broke the rain guard off. So on the right-hand side, there is the window. And of course, even the seal on the window is broken in between the two layers of glass, and the paint's peeling up inside. Now, the photograph on the right is said to be taken halfway to the moon in zero gravity. So in zero gravity, water is running down the window. Okay.
And it's supposed to be 240 below zero and would be frozen if it were real.
And doesn't freeze.
It's all absurd. It's all just absurd beyond belief, Scott. Absurd beyond belief.
This is just mock-up equipment that they were using to do the filming. None of it's real. None of it's functional. Okay? And it was used like this is exactly the same equipment for all 6 missions. The same rover, the same LEM. Everything is being used over and over again.
God.
Okay? And of course, you can see there's no footprints around anywhere near that can. It's back
we got a beer can on the moon.
Like I said, if I found the pizza boxes, I'd know what company
I know. God.
I got tons more. This one's great. Look at that. Look at that nose cone of that rocket up there. That missile.
In the top right?
Yep. That's it in the background. This is Apollo 14. Okay. And in the center picture, you can see where the nose cone is there. Those are 2 cars up on their sides.
Wow.
Okay. Now, down in between, you see the round on the left car up on its side?
Yes.
Just look over a little bit. You'll see a perfectly round ring. That's about a 59 Ford with the Continental kit on it. That's the tire sitting up there, buried in the dirt. That's another car sitting in there. And then on the bottom right, I didn't use another photograph. Just to the right of this photograph, the next picture over, on the bottom, that is the Bentley that they even mention in audio, and it's in the transcript.
A Bentley.
That's the Bentley. You can see that car sitting there.
One of the most expensive cars in the world in the landfill.
Yeah, but they threw them out. Probably Elvis Presley's. Now, this is Apollo 11. Now, Apollo 11 weren't so bold when they were doing stuff. They simply took a photograph of the equipment. So there's a close-up of what's down inside that crater. And you can see the top arrow there. That's a gear with the chain on it running down. Those are all gear cases. And then this great big case down on the bottom. And it's got this big arm sticking out on it. Kind of almost a bucket scissor arm, claw arm sticking out. But that's the actual gear case sitting right there. And like Kip Teague has tried to hide most of this stuff and erase it and blur it. And he's using Photoshop effects on it, right, to make it grainy and everything else. But they're all right there. That gear case is the same. That chain at the top is just a dead giveaway, right? But all of that stuff down there is just scrap metal parts.
Junk.
Yep. Now you can see how the astronauts, this is Apollo 14, they're using the handle there to point out where that rock is, where that face is, right?
Yes.
And once you understand that the astronauts are pointing it out, okay, there are many ways to point it out. Sometimes they just get off the rover and take a walk out and around it and back. They'll just walk around it and back and you'll see it sticking out of the dirt or whatever, right? That's how they point it out. Sometimes they use this kind of method. I wouldn't have found that unless I started to understand how the astronauts were pointing it out.
Yeah.
And you could just say, oh, that's just an unusual rock that looks like a face. Okay, but it's painted. That's an Indian head, and the band is painted on the rock. This is that's a ball bag, you know, when you go grab 100 for the driving range.
Yeah.
Well, some of the golf courses back in the 60s, they just had little miniature golf bags that you carried them out in, right? And the GC on the bottom is a golf course.
Wow.
And of course, then I had to throw the sea rock in too, because NASA wants to get rid of the sea. This is Apollo 11. That's the sea rock in Apollo 11. And of course, the inset one there is the actual sea rock from Apollo 16, right? I have found that same rock in, I can't remember which one I didn't find it in, but I got it out of 5 out of 6 missions. That rock is in there because they're using the same set on the same location. This one, they took a lot of trouble. They had to trench this out to lift this rock up. And that shows you how they sprayed the equipment on the top left there. So it's like they're using a plaster or concrete, whatever, to make the rock itself. They're sticking all kinds of unusual pieces, whatever's on the ground, they're just sticking it in there for filler. And then they're putting that spray on, the same as they did over the cars, right? That's the spray. Like it's a clay mold spray or whatever. But you can see it's shot on, the rock's laying on its side. If it got on there over time, when it was laying down, it would fall vertical onto it, and it shot sideways on and stuck this way. You can see it. But you can see the clear line on where they were doing it, right? Oh, and if you back one up a bit, back that other one back up. On the right, you can see that there's a steel bar there with rope tied around it. See the rope tied around the knots?
I'm looking at it. I see the end of the bar down here to the right. The arrows are pointing to various aspects of it.
Yeah, where the rope is tied around. There's rope tied around each one. There's the knots on the left-hand side, and you can see the rope going across it. Now this one, there he is pointing it out again, right? The astronaut's nicely pointing it out. And this is a different design on how they made a rock. They made a wire cage and then covered it over. And the close-up is showing you the cage, the mesh that's underneath that rock. And that's just one example of what you'll find. You'll find 3 or 4 more of those in Apollo 15 doing the same thing. Now this is the Apollo 17 press kit. The image is on the right-hand side. Okay. The press kit, of course, was released months in advance prior to launch. So somebody was able to completely show the view from the commander's window, the entire view of the entire scene at the bottom there, and then the schematic view at the top right. Okay, the lander itself is basically in the middle of that scene, and in the actual photograph, in the photographs to the left is the bottom right. Okay, these hills, if you look closely on that, they have arrows on them so they can be moved. That little thing in there shows arrows that they can be slid up and down or side to side to move them into place.
So once again, they've got a press kit that reveals features that would only have been discerned had this been real after landing on the moon and you took the photographs, blowing their cover completely. It's difficult to see how this could have been inadvertent.
This shows how they built the set. That said sculptured hills. It says subfloor. right at the front. It says subfloor.
Yeah.
I'll send you the big one on that. Those are arrows on the lines of the mountains to show that they can slide up and down or move side to side as they place them. So
Scott, this is just embarrassing, just embarrassing.
So I put these 3 photographs together. I put the names of the photographs up there to show the layout. That layout that you're looking down to is actually to the front of that schematic. It's shooting that way.
Nicely done.
What you see on the left is the bottom right on the schematic is the left side of the photographs. That's what you're looking down to.
Nicely done, Scott.
Okay, and they put all that together. This is my lyrics for Walking on the Moon. When I was studying through this stuff and I was listening to some music at the time, right, and I was looking at the EVA suit, and I spotted, you can see that it says sunglasses pocket. Okay.
Sunglasses pocket?
Yes. And if you're out on an EVA and you realize how that suit's put together, I mean, that front visor lifts up and down, but then there's an entire glass jar bell in there that locks everything in. You got to take the whole thing off to put sunglasses on, right? And you're certainly not going to do that in a vacuum. Okay. And NASA had payload specialists to reduce every ounce of weight everywhere they could. Okay. They even claimed to have counted every stitch in their spacesuits to keep the weight down. So why would there be a pocket there for sunglasses?
Completely superfluous, presumably. So this is the lyrics by the Police, Walking on the Moon?
These are my lyrics to their song, Walking on the Moon. So it says, show me how to wear these, walking on the moon. I want to look real cool now, walking on the moon. Don't want you to tease me, walking on the moon. Show me how to wear these, walking on the moon. Right? And then at the very bottom it says, give it up, right? Over on the bottom left is the NASA, and that's my acronym, not a single apology.
Versus never a straight answer.
Well, everybody else has their own. That's my own. I made that one up. Not a single apology, NASA.
I like this. Some say I am full of wit, while others say just half. So take me on your spaceship and we'll have a good old laugh and we'll go walking on the moon.
Yes, that's my personal quote.
Love it. Scott, this is completely stunning. I love it. You've done a brilliant job with this. I'm blown away. Absolutely blown away.
Well, you'll have to sit down. Paul and I, like I said, we've got 6 or 7 videos out. I did 3.5 hours on Globebusters, going through these photographs, which are other than what we just looked at as well. Paul and I have plans for at least probably another 4 or 5 more videos to expose some of the stuff.
Completely sensational, Scott. I can't tell you how much I appreciate this. I want to have you on my show when we get this up and we'll talk about it on the radio. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, thanking my special guest, Scott Henderson, for a completely brilliant debunking of any lingering beliefs that we went to the moon. Scott, you've done a brilliant job. You have my congratulations. I cannot thank you enough for spending this time with me here and now. And thanks to all of you for watching.